Jake Hayes was 3 days into what should have been a simple salvage run when everything went sideways. His small rig, the Tin Can Sally, rattled as he pushed her deeper into the Kelvin abyss than any pilot with half a brain would dare. The gas giant's upper atmosphere was a graveyard for ships, a place where metal went to die and salvagers went to disappear. Most crews stuck to the shallow layers where the pickings were easy and the risks manageable. But Jake wasn't most crews. He was a solo operator, a mechanic who'd spent 20 years fixing things other people threw away. He had a reputation in the outer sectors for being stubborn, maybe a little crazy, and too damn good at making broken things work again. The toxic fog outside his viewport was so thick he could barely see 10 meters ahead. Yellow and green clouds swirled past, filled with acids that would eat through standard hull plating in minutes. His console lit up red with warnings. Temperature alerts. Pressure alerts. Radiation spikes. The computer's synthetic voice kept telling him to turn back, but Jake had learned to trust his gut more than machines. And his gut said something important was down here. His sensors pinged again. The reading was massive, easily the size of a small moon. But that wasn't what made Jake's hands tighten on the controls. The signal showed both mechanical and organic signatures mixed together in a way that shouldn't be possible. Metal and living tissue fused into one thing. Jake pushed the Sally forward through another layer of caustic fog. The ship groaned in protest, her old engines straining. Then the clouds parted for just a moment and Jake saw it. His breath caught in his throat. A ship. But calling it just a ship felt wrong, like calling an ocean just water. The thing was enormous, easily the length of 20 city blocks, maybe more. Parts of it looked like it had been grown rather than built. Curved organic plating wrapped around mechanical structures in ways that seemed both beautiful and impossible. Great wing-like structures extended from its sides, motionless and half-buried in atmospheric debris. But what really grabbed Jake's attention was the state of it. Every surface was covered in rust so thick it looked like dried blood. Glowing slime dripped from its hull in long sheets, bioluminescent and wrong-looking. And everywhere, clustered so thick they looked like a second skin, were barnacles. Not normal barnacles though. These things were the size of his fist, pulsing with sickly yellow light, clearly feeding on whatever was left of the ship. Jake had heard stories about ships like this. Every salvager had. The Dracari matriarch-class vessels, called Dragon Mothers by the old-timers. The Dracari had been an ancient civilization, builders of biomechanical wonders that made modern technology look like children's toys. But they'd been gone for thousands of years. Their empire had collapsed into dust and legend. This Dragon Mother should have been dead too. A corpse floating in the dark. Jake checked his instruments again. His hands were shaking slightly and he forced them steady. There it was. A power signature. Faint, irregular, but definitely there. Like a heartbeat struggling to keep going. The ship was alive. No way, Jake whispered to himself. No damn way. He brought the Sally in closer, careful not to scrape against any of the debris. His magnetic grapples extended, locking onto the least corroded section of hull he could find. The clamps connected with a solid thunk that vibrated through his ship. The moment contact was made, something changed. The Dragon Mother shuddered, a movement that traveled along her entire length like a person stirring from a deep sleep. Then lights began to flicker. Weak, dying lights that sparked along what must have been her spine, running from bow to stern in irregular pulses. Jake's helmet display crackled with interference. Then, through the static, a hologram formed in front of him. It was a figure, clearly female in shape, but broken and incomplete. Parts of her face would appear and vanish. An arm would extend toward him, then dissolve into pixels. She looked ghostly, desperate, like someone drowning and reaching for help. Jake had been in the salvage business long enough to see a lot of strange things. But this was different. This wasn't just the ship's automated distress system. There was something aware behind those flickering eyes. Something that had been waiting in the darkness for a very long time. The hologram reached toward him one more time before falling apart completely. Jake sat there for a long moment, staring at where the figure had been. Every bit of training, every safety protocol he'd ever learned, told him to disconnect and get the hell out. This ship was ancient, unknown, and possibly dangerous. There were 100 ways this could kill him. But Jake had never been good at walking away from things that needed fixing. He unbuckled his harness and grabbed his toolkit from the storage locker. The tools inside had saved more machines than he could count. Maybe, just maybe, they could save one more. "All right, girl," Jake said, pulling on his work gloves. "Let's see what we can do." Jake lost track of time after the first day. His internal clock stopped meaning anything when he started cutting into the Dragon Mother's systems. Sleep became something other people did. Food was whatever protein bars he could eat with one hand while his other hand stayed busy with a welding torch. The work was brutal. Every layer of parasitic growth he cut through revealed something worse underneath. The barnacle-like creatures had burrowed deep, their roots spreading through the ship's systems like cancer. Where they'd been feeding, the metal was paper-thin and crumbling. The organic components were even worse, infected with something that looked like rot but moved like it was still alive. Jake had worked on hundreds of ships in his career. Freighters, warships, luxury cruisers, everything. But this was different. The Dragon Mother wasn't just metal and wires. She was a fusion of technology and biology that shouldn't exist according to any engineering manual he'd ever read. Neural pathways made of something that was part fiber optic cable and part nervous tissue ran through her hull. Power conduits that pulsed like veins carried energy in ways his instruments couldn't fully measure. And all of it was dying. On the second day, Jake found what he thought was her primary neural cluster. It was buried deep in her core, a massive tangle of pathways that must have been her brain. Or maybe her heart. With the Dragon Mother, it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. The cluster was completely choked with infection. Black corruption spread through the pathways like poison in blood vessels. Jake spent 6 hours just clearing away the dead tissue, being careful not to damage anything that might still be working. His hands cramped. His back screamed. He kept going. That's when she started showing him things. The broken holograms appeared more frequently now. They weren't random anymore. Jake saw images, memories maybe, playing out in the air around him. A crew of Dracari, the ancient builders, walking through corridors that were clean and bright. They looked almost human, but taller, with skin that shimmered like oil on water. And they loved their ship. Jake could see it in the way they touched her walls, the way they spoke to her like she was family. He saw battles. The Dragon Mother tearing through enemy fleets with weapons that made modern warships look like toys. She'd been magnificent once, powerful and proud. Then he saw the end. The Dracari Empire crumbling. Resources running out. One by one, the great ships were abandoned as their people tried to save themselves. And finally he saw them leave her here. Not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't fix her. They didn't have the parts, the time, or the knowledge anymore. She'd been damaged too badly and their civilization was dying too fast. They'd left her in the Kelvin abyss to fade away quietly. Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his glove, surprised to find them wet. He looked at the corroded systems around him, then up at the flickering hologram of a Dracari woman who might have been the ship's captain once. "They left you," Jake said, his voice rough from not speaking to anyone real in days. He turned back to the neural cluster and started welding a bypass around the most damaged section. "But I won't. I don't leave things broken if I can help it." The hologram changed. The fragmented images stopped jumping around and stabilized. For just a moment, Jake saw her clearly. An alien face, beautiful in its strangeness, with eyes that held thousands of years of loneliness. She was looking right at him and he could see something in her expression. Hope maybe. Or just the desperate wish not to die alone in the dark. Then the image flickered and disappeared again. Jake got back to work. His methods would have made any certified guild engineer have a heart attack. He didn't have proper Dracari components, so he improvised. A bypass made from his ship's spare cables. A power regulator pulled from his emergency backup systems. When he found a section of bioconduit that was completely dead, he cut it out and spliced in synthetic tissue from his medical kit. He talked to her the whole time. Explained what he was doing like she was a patient on an operating table. "Alright, this is gonna hurt a bit. I'm replacing this conduit with human synthetic tissue. Not ideal, but it'll get your blood flowing again. Just hang in there." And she responded. He could feel it. When he made a good connection, her systems would hum, a vibration that felt almost like a purr. When something hurt, her lights would dim and pulse erratically. She was communicating the only way she could. By the third day, Jake could see real progress. Sections of her hull that had been dark for centuries began glowing with faint bioluminescence. Her power core, which had been barely flickering when he arrived, steadied into something approaching a normal rhythm. The hologram appeared more often and stayed longer each time. Jake was exhausted down to his bones, running on caffeine and stubbornness. But he kept working because he could feel her fighting alongside him. Every repair he made, she tried to help, rerouting power, activating dormant systems, reaching out with whatever strength she had left. She was trusting him. Maybe for the first time in thousands of years, the Dragon Mother was letting someone close enough to help. Jake patched the last connection on the neural cluster and stepped back. The whole thing lit up, pathways firing in sequence like a thought moving through a brain. The hologram appeared beside him, clearer than ever before, and for just a second, he swore she smiled. "We're getting there, girl," Jake said, allowing himself a tired grin. "We're actually getting there." Jake thought he'd seen the worst of it. 3 days of cutting through rot and rust, and he figured the hard part was behind him. He was wrong. The Dragon Mother's systems were coming back online steadily. Her power core had stabilized. Her neural pathways were firing properly for the first time in centuries. Jake was in the middle of replacing a corroded circuit panel when he noticed something odd. The barnacles covering the nearby hull section were moving. Not just shifting in place. Actually moving. Crawling. Jake stopped working and watched. One of the barnacle-like parasites detached from the hull with a wet sucking sound. Then another. Then a dozen more. They dropped to the deck plating around him, and that's when Jake realized his mistake. These weren't just parasites. They were Skrell. He'd heard about Skrell from other salvagers, usually in bars after too many drinks. Hive creatures that infested dead ships, feeding on whatever was left until nothing remained but dust. Most people thought they were just stories, something to scare rookie salvagers. Jake had always figured they were real but rare enough that he'd never have to worry about them. He'd figured wrong. The Skrell started changing. Their hard shells cracked open, and things emerged that made Jake's stomach turn. They looked like a nightmare combination of insect and crystal, with too many legs and mouths full of teeth that glittered like broken glass. And there weren't just a dozen of them. Thousands of the things were detaching from the Dragon Mother's hull, all at once, like someone had rung a dinner bell. Jake understood what had happened. The Skrell had been dormant, feeding slowly on the dying ship for centuries. But now that the Dragon Mother was healing, coming back to life, they sensed they were about to lose their food source. And they weren't happy about it. The attack came during what Jake's chronometer said was midnight cycle, though time didn't mean much in the perpetual fog of the Kelvin abyss. The Skrell swarmed toward him in a wave of chittering, crystalline bodies. They moved fast, scuttling across the hull plating with clicking sounds that echoed through the corridor. Not today. Jake grabbed his plasma torch and fired it at the first creatures to reach him. The superheated beam cut through 3 of them and they shattered like glass. But more kept coming, crawling over the bodies of the fallen, driven by pure hunger. Jake backed up against the exposed systems he'd been working on, trying to protect the vulnerable circuits. A Skrell leaped at his face and he swatted it away with his toolkit. Another latched onto his leg, its crystalline teeth scraping against his suit's armor plating. He kicked it off and crushed it under his boot. But there were too many. Way too many. They were going to overwhelm him through sheer numbers, drag him down, and then go back to feeding on the Dragon Mother. Jake's mind raced, trying to figure out how to fight off a swarm when his plasma torch could only hit one target at a time. That's when the Dragon Mother decided to join the fight. Jake heard it before he saw it. A deep humming sound that vibrated through the deck plating and rattled his teeth. Ancient weapon systems that he hadn't even found yet, let alone repaired, were coming online all by themselves. Plasma cannons mounted along the hull's interior activated with a sound like thunder. They fired in controlled bursts, each shot taking out clusters of Skrell. Bioelectric defenses that must have been dormant for thousands of years crackled to life, sending arcs of blue lightning across the hull. Every Skrell the electricity touched convulsed and fell, their crystalline bodies shattering on impact. The Dragon Mother was protecting him. Jake could feel her diverting power away from her own healing systems, pulling energy from the repairs he'd made, all to keep him safe. She was fighting for him the same way he'd been fighting for her. Jake couldn't help but grin, even with Skrell trying to tear him apart. "So you do care, huh, girl?" The hologram flickered into existence beside him, clearer than it had been in days. The Drakri woman pointed toward a junction box near Jake's feet. Jake understood immediately. She was showing him where to strike. He pulled open the junction box and found exactly what he needed. A main power conduit running to the primary Skrell nest. These things had been living on the Dragon Mother so long they'd tapped into her systems like parasites hooking into veins. Jake worked fast, rerouting power and overriding safeties that were screaming at him to stop. He rigged a plasma purge, something that would send a massive surge of energy through that conduit and burn out everything connected to it. It would hurt the Dragon Mother too, but right now they needed the Skrell gone more than they needed to be careful. "Hold on," Jake warned and triggered the purge. The effect was immediate and devastating. Plasma energy erupted through the Skrell nest like a bomb going off. The creatures connected to the main colony shrieked, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then they started dying. Hundreds of them shattered or burned, their crystalline bodies unable to handle the surge. And the Dragon Mother roared. It was a sound Jake felt more than heard. Deep and primal, echoing through her entire structure like the cry of something ancient and powerful that refused to die quietly. The remaining Skrell, the ones that hadn't been connected to the nest, stopped their attack. They turned and fled, scuttling back into the fog-filled abyss, driven away by something they recognized as a predator. Silence fell. Jake stood there, breathing hard, surrounded by shattered Skrell bodies that were already dissolving into dust. They'd won. But victory came with a price. The Dragon Mother's systems began failing almost immediately. The battle had overtaxed her, pulled too much power from her already fragile core. Her lights started dimming one by one. The hologram appeared in front of Jake one last time, but she looked weaker than ever. Transparent. Fading. She reached toward him and Jake reached back, his hand passing through hers. Then she dissolved into nothing. No, no, no. Jake sprinted down the corridor toward the main reactor chamber, his boots pounding against the deck. Stay with me. Don't you dare give up now. But the Dragon Mother's heartbeat was getting weaker with every step he took. Jake stood in the reactor chamber, staring at the Dragon Mother's biomechanical heart. It was the size of a small house, a massive fusion core that pulsed with weak, irregular beats. Each pulse was fainter than the last. He'd seen enough dying engines in his life to know what this meant. The core was failing. And when it went, everything else would follow. Jake pulled up diagnostics on his portable scanner, even though he already knew what they'd show. The core was too damaged. The Skrell battle had pushed it past its limits. No amount of bypasses or quick fixes would save it now. What it needed was a complete replacement, and replacement parts for ancient Drakri technology didn't exist anymore. The civilization that built this ship had been dust for thousands of years. Any sensible person would have accepted it, cut their losses, called it a noble effort and moved on. The Dragon Mother had lasted this long. Maybe dying in battle, protecting someone who tried to help her, was a better end than rusting away alone in the dark. But Jake Hayes had never been accused of being sensible. He walked around the fusion core, studying it from every angle. His mind was already working, turning over possibilities that most engineers would laugh at. The Dragon Mother's hologram flickered weakly in the corner, barely visible now, watching him. Crazy idea, Jake said out loud, his voice echoing in the chamber. But you trusted me this far, didn't you? The hologram didn't respond. Maybe she couldn't anymore. Jake made his decision. He headed back to his ship, the Tin Can Sally, still docked to the Dragon Mother's hull. What he was about to do went against every survival instinct he had. But he'd stopped listening to those instincts about 3 days ago. He disconnected his own ship's reactor. The Sally went dark around him, life support switching to emergency batteries that would last maybe 6 hours. His way home, his escape route, everything that kept him alive out here, all of it depended on that reactor. And he was about to tear it out. Jake worked with the kind of focused intensity that came from knowing there was no backup plan. He carefully extracted the reactor core, a compact human-made fusion unit that was maybe a tenth the size of the Dragon Mother's heart. It was good technology, reliable, but it was made for a ship that could fit in one of the Dragon Mother's cargo bays. What he was planning shouldn't work. Human technology and ancient Drakri biosystems were like oil and water. Different energy signatures. Different operational frequencies. Different everything. Every engineering textbook ever written would tell him he was wasting his time. Jake carried the reactor into the Dragon Mother's chamber and got to work anyway. The next 4 days blurred together into an exhausting nightmare of welding, rewiring, and recalibration. Jake ran power conduits from his human reactor into the Dragon Mother's biomechanical systems. He jury-rigged adapters to bridge the gap between technologies that had never been meant to touch. He bypassed safeguards, overrode fail-safes, and did things that would have gotten him banned from every engineering guild in known space. He talked to her the whole time. The hologram was too weak to appear anymore, but Jake kept explaining what he was doing anyway. I'm running your neural pathways through my reactor's power management system. It's gonna feel weird, but it should let you draw energy in a way your damaged core can't handle anymore. You've just gotta meet me halfway on this, alright? No response. But Jake thought maybe the lights pulsed a little stronger for just a moment. When the integration was finally complete, Jake stood back and looked at his work. Cables and conduits ran everywhere, connecting human technology to alien biology in ways that looked more like art than engineering. It was ugly and improvised and probably insane. Jake activated the hybrid core. For a moment, nothing happened. Then power started flowing and everything went wrong. The energy surged wildly, completely unstable. Human and Drakri systems fought each other, frequencies clashing instead of synchronizing. The Dragon Mother's hull groaned, metal screaming in protest. Lights exploded along her corridors. Her entire structure convulsed like she was in pain. She was dying. Faster than before. No. Jake watched in horror as his attempt to save her turned into the thing that would kill her. Fight. Don't give up on me now. But the systems kept overloading. The hybrid core was tearing itself apart and taking the Dragon Mother with it. Jake's eyes fell on the neural interface cable, the crude connection rig he'd used once before to communicate with her systems. It was dangerous, meant for diagnostic purposes only. Connecting a human brain directly to a ship's neural network could cause permanent damage. Could kill him. Jake grabbed the cable and jammed it against his temple. Pain exploded through his skull the moment the connection formed. It felt like his brain was being pulled apart and put back together wrong. He screamed but forced himself to keep the connection active. And suddenly he wasn't alone in his head anymore. He felt her. The Dragon Mother's consciousness, vast and ancient and so tired. Exhaustion that came from millennia of loneliness. The pain of abandonment. The slow fade into darkness that she'd thought would never end. She'd given up. She was ready to let go. Jake pushed back with everything he had. He flooded the connection with his own memories. Every engine he'd saved when others said it was junk. Every ship he'd repaired when the experts said it couldn't be done. Every broken thing he'd refused to abandon because broken didn't mean worthless. The image of his father's old workshop, teaching him that nothing was beyond saving if you cared enough. The satisfaction of hearing an engine roar back to life after days of work. The stubborn, human belief that giving up was never an option. You're not alone anymore, Jake thought with every ounce of will he possessed. I'm here. I'm not leaving. So fight. Something shifted. The Dragon Mother's consciousness stirred, responding to his determination. Their minds merged at the edges, human stubbornness mixing with ancient strength. And through their connection the hybrid core felt it too. The clashing frequencies began to synchronize. Human technology and Drakari biosystems stopped fighting and started working together. Energy flowed smoothly, stable, growing stronger with each pulse. The hybrid core caught and held. Power surged through the Dragon Mother's systems, but this time it was controlled, purposeful. Her lights blazed to life, brighter than they'd been in centuries. Her hull sang with renewed energy. The hologram appeared, solid and clear, eyes wide with wonder. Jake collapsed, the neural cable falling from his temple. His head felt like it had been split open, but he was grinning anyway. They'd done it. The impossible had just happened. The Dragon Mother lived. The Dragon Mother's ascent from the Kelvin abyss took 6 hours. Jake piloted her carefully, nursing the hybrid core and monitoring every system as they climbed through the toxic fog. The deeper layers gave way to clearer atmosphere and finally they broke through into open space. The salvage fleet that worked the outer layers of the abyss went completely silent when they saw her. Ships that had been dragging debris stopped mid-operation. Communication channels fell quiet. Every sensor in the area locked onto the massive vessel rising from the depths like something out of legend. The Dragon Mother was magnificent. Her hull, once covered in rust and rot, now gleamed with bioluminescence that pulsed in waves of blue and green. The bioarmor had regenerated, smooth and alive, rippling like the skin of some great creature. And woven throughout her ancient structure, human technology glowed with warm orange light. Power conduits Jake had installed ran along her spine like veins. His reactor core pulsed at her heart, beating in perfect sync with her original systems. She was a fusion of two civilizations separated by thousands of years, held together by one mechanic who'd refused to accept that broken meant dead. Jake sat in what had been her command center, a vast chamber that had reconfigured itself to accommodate him. The hologram appeared beside his chair, and this time she was perfect. Clear. Stable. Solid enough that Jake almost thought he could touch her. She looked like a woman in her prime, tall and graceful, with features that were alien but somehow still beautiful. Her eyes shone with intelligence that was older than human civilization, but there was something else there too. Something warm when she looked at him. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was clear and real, the first word she'd spoken in millennia. "You gave me life when I had accepted death." Jake laughed, the sound coming out rough and exhausted but genuinely happy. He'd been running on caffeine and stubbornness for over a week, and every muscle in his body hurt. But hearing her voice made it all worth it. "You're welcome," he said and meant it completely. News of what happened spread through the outer sectors faster than lightspeed communication. Within days everyone knew the story. A human salvager had resurrected a Dragon Mother, one of the legendary Drakari matriarch-class ships that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. They came calling almost immediately. The engineering guild sent representatives offering Jake more money than he'd make in 10 lifetimes if he'd let them study the hybrid core. Military contractors wanted to buy the Dragon Mother, claiming ships that powerful shouldn't be in private hands. Scientific institutions begged for access, calling the fusion of human and Dracari technology the greatest archaeological find in centuries. Some wanted to preserve her. Others wanted to take her apart piece by piece to understand how she worked. The Dragon Mother refused them all. Jake watched the various delegations leave, frustrated and empty-handed. The hologram stood beside him, arms crossed, looking remarkably human in her stubbornness. "They don't understand," she said quietly. "They see a machine to be studied. A weapon to be used. They look at me the way my creators did at the end when I was just a problem they couldn't solve." Jake nodded. "But that's not what you are." "No." She turned to him and her expression softened. "You saw something else. You saw someone worth saving even when saving me meant stranding yourself. You stayed when everyone else, even my own people, left." The bond between them had formed during that neural connection, when Jake's mind had touched hers. It went deeper than words, transcending the barriers between human and alien, organic and machine. The Dragon Mother had chosen Jake as her captain, not because he owned her, but because he'd earned her trust in the only way that mattered. He'd cared when no one else did. They left the Kelvin Abyss together, not as salvager and salvage but as partners. The Dragon Mother flew through space with a grace that belied her enormous size, and Jake learned to work with her systems, understanding that he wasn't just piloting a ship. He was working with someone who had her own opinions about where to go and how fast to get there. Weeks passed. They wandered the outer sectors, and Jake found himself more content than he'd been in years. He'd spent his whole life fixing broken things alone. Now he had a partner who understood. Then the distress signal came through. A colony ship, the New Providence, broadcasting on emergency channels. Their message was desperate. Main engines failing. Life support critical. 3,000 colonists on board, including hundreds of children. They were drifting in deep space and their systems were shutting down one by one. Jake pulled up the location data and felt his stomach sink. The New Providence was in the Barrens, a stretch of space so remote that no commercial ships went there. The few vessels close enough to help would have seen the signal, done the math on rescue time versus profit and moved on. Too much risk. Too little reward. That was how the business worked. But Jake had stopped thinking like a businessman about the same time he decided to save a dying ship in the Kelvin Abyss. He looked at the hologram. The Dragon Mother was already pulling up navigation data, her eyes gleaming with something that looked a lot like anticipation. "Well?" she asked, and there was the hint of a smile on her alien features. "What do you think?" Jake smiled back and reached for the controls. "I think 3,000 people need help and nobody else is going to give it to them." He adjusted their course, pointing the Dragon Mother toward the Barrens. "Let's get to work." The Dragon Mother's engines flared bright against the darkness of space, burning with combined human and Dracari power. They accelerated, racing toward people who needed saving, guided by a mechanic who'd never learned how to give up and a ship who'd been given a second chance at life. Behind them, the stars watched a legend being born. Not of a ship or a man alone, but of what they became together. A living vessel and a stubborn human, hunting through the galaxy for the next impossible thing worth saving. Because that's what they did now. That's what they'd always do. And somewhere in the darkness, broken things waited, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone would care enough to help them too.